The night air of Florence in 1528 carried the heavy scent of river mud, wood smoke, and impending storm. In a narrow workshop, nestled along the alleyways behind Santa Croce, 24 years old, Gianna Rossi blew a gentle breath across a faded parchment page. Fine gray dust drifted into the candlelight, revealing dense Latin script written in the precise hand of a long-dead scribe. Outside her window, the city was uneasy. The Medici forces had been driven out, but rumors of war and siege lingered in every tavern. Yet, inside this room, among stacks of bound leather and jars of oak gall ink, time stood still. Gianna was a restorer craft, taught to her by her late father, a master scholar who had vanished 3 years prior under mysterious circumstances. Gianna reached for a brass bone folder to smooth out the spine of a massive double-bound codex brought to her by a cloaked customer earlier that evening. The man had paid in heavy Venetian ducats and demanded the binding be repaired before dawn, offering no name and leaving no trail. As her tool pressed into the thick calfskin cover, Gianna felt an unusual lump near the back spine. It was too rigid to be simple glue or folded parchment. Carefully, using a razor-sharp scalpel, she sliced open the inner lining of the back cover. Beneath the decaying leather lay not blank vellum, but a hidden compartment lined with oiled silk. Inside rested a small, leather-bound notebook covered in complex geometrical diagrams and mathematical ciphers. Gianna's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It belonged to her father. Her hands trembled as she opened the first page. Written in faded red ink were 3 words that every scholar in Tuscany whispered only in shadows. Bibliotheca abscondita, the hidden library. A cold draft swept through the room, causing the candle flame to flicker violently. Outside, the sound of iron-shod boots echoed against the cobblestones, stopping directly outside her heavy wooden door. Someone was standing on the threshold. The heavy thud of leather boots against the cobblestones outside Gianna's door held her frozen. She pressed her back against the wooden workbench, her hand instinctively shielding her father's newly discovered notebook. The heavy iron latch on the front door rattled, but after a tense moment, the footsteps faded down the damp alleyway. Gianna took a shaky breath and collapsed onto her stool. The air in the small Florentine workshop felt suddenly suffocating. She pulled the small notebook closer to the flickering candlelight, opening the parchment pages covered in her father's meticulous handwriting. For years, scholars across Italy had treated the Bibliotheca Abscondita as nothing more than a myth, a grand legend about a secret repository created during the fall of the Medici dynasty to preserve priceless ancient texts, lost Greek philosophies, and dangerous scientific discoveries. But looking at these pages, Gianna realized the truth. Her father hadn't just studied the legend, he had found its trail. The pages were filled with complex ciphers and geometric grids. As a skilled restorer, Gianna had spent years learning the art of hidden scripts and ancient languages under her father's guidance. She pulled a piece of blank vellum toward her and began decoding the first sequence of numbers. The numbers corresponded to architectural measurements. Her father had left a ledger mapping out specific structures across Florence. The first entry pointed directly to an ancient crypt beneath the Basilica of San Lorenzo. But beneath the architectural notes was a stern warning in her father's hand. To speak of the vault is to invite the blade. Trust only those who bear the mark of the quiet cross. Gianna stared at the words as the reality of her situation sank in. Her father hadn't simply died of a sudden illness 3 years ago. He had been running from someone, and whoever had paid her to repair the double-bound codex tonight was likely tracking the exact same secret. She quickly hid the small notebook inside her thick woolen tunic, grabbed her heavy dark cloak, and blew out the candle. The streets of Florence in 1528 were alive with spies, political chaos, and mercenary guilds. Leaving the workshop in the dead of night was dangerous, but staying meant certain capture. She needed to reach San Lorenzo before whoever was watching her shop decided to break down the door. A thick river fog rolled off the Arno, wrapping the narrow, twisting alleyways of Florence in a cold, gray shroud. Gianna kept her head low, her leather boots stepping softly across the slick cobblestones. The city was under night curfew, and the occasional glare of a patrol torch flickered off the stone walls in the distance. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her. Her father's notebook pressed heavy against her ribs, a secret capable of bringing down noble houses or triggering church inquisitions. As she turned down the corridor toward the Piazza del Duomo, a sharp sound broke the silence. The metallic scrape of a sword scabbard against stone. Gianna paused, holding her breath inside the dark archway of an apothecary shop. Behind her, about 30 paces back, 2 figures stepped out of the fog. They wore dark wool coats, but under the faint moonlight, Gianna caught the dull glint of polished iron breastplates. These were not municipal city guards. They moved with the quiet precision of hired mercenaries. The Iron Ring, a ruthless guild of enforcers known to work for the highest political bidder in Tuscany. Panic flared in her chest. They hadn't knocked on her door earlier because they were waiting for her to lead them to the key. Gianna didn't wait to see if they noticed her. She pulled her cloak tight and bolted down the narrow side street toward the Basilica of San Lorenzo. Her heart hammered against her ribs as her boots slapped against the wet stone. Behind her, the heavy, rhythmic thud of running footsteps confirmed her fears. They were giving chase. She took a sharp left, navigating the maze of streets by memory. The massive, untextured facade of San Lorenzo loomed ahead like a silent stone mountain in the mist. The main, heavy oak doors were chained shut for the night. But her father had often worked on the church's restoration projects. She knew about the small, low-arched side door used by the monks. Gianna ducked into the shadow of the basilica's portico, grabbed the heavy iron ring of the side entrance, and turned it. The door gave way with a soft creak. She slipped inside just as 2 dark figures, rounding the corner, shouted into the fog. Slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. She leaned against the cool interior stone, gasping for air in the pitch-black silence of the church. The interior of the basilica smelled of old incense, melting beeswax, and centuries of cold stone. Tall marble columns rose into the shadows, bathed in the soft red glow of small prayer candles flickering along the altar. Gianna stood frozen against the heavy wooden door, listening as the mercenaries outside hammered their fists once against the oak before their angry voices faded down the street. "You should not be here, child. The sanctuary is closed tonight, wanderers." A low, calm voice echoed through the nave. Gianna jumped, turning toward the shadows near the choir stalls. A tall figure stepped into the candle glow, wearing the rough brown habit of a Franciscan monk. His face was weathered, framed by gray hair, but his dark eyes were sharp and alert. "Father Matteo," Gianna breathed, her voice trembling with relief. Father Matteo had been her father's closest academic colleague, a man of deep faith who secretly believed that preserving knowledge was a divine duty, even when that knowledge challenged the Church's strict doctrines. "Gianna!" Matteo's brows furrowed as he hurried forward, his sandals soft on the marble floor. "What has happened?" "You look as though you've seen the specters of the plague." Without a word, Gianna reached into her tunic and pulled out her father's leather ledger. Matteo's eyes widened instantly. He stepped back, as if the small book were on fire. "Where did you find this?" he whispered, his calm demeanor instantly shattering. "I thought your father destroyed his research before he disappeared. It was hidden inside a codex brought to my shop tonight," Gianna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Men followed me here, men in iron armor." Matteo took the book with trembling hands, turning to a specific page marked with geometric ciphers. He closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy sigh. "The Bibliotheca Abscondita," Matteo muttered softly. "Your father was playing a dangerous game, Gianna. That library contains texts that powerful nobility and corrupt church leaders have spent 2 centuries trying to burn. If Count Lorenzo's men know you have this ledger, no street in Italy will be safe for you." He looked at her sternly. "The secrets inside this book are not just history, Gianna. They are weapons, and the hunt for them has officially begun." Father Matteo insisted that Gianna stay hidden within the basilica until dawn, but a cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. If the mercenaries were tracking her, her workshop was in immediate danger. Decades of her father's unstudied manuscripts, historical records, and personal journals were stored in that small room behind Santa Croce. Before the first light of dawn broke over the rooftops of Florence, Gianna slipped out through the church's cloister gate, ignoring Father Matteo's warnings. The morning fog had begun to clear, revealing a pale gray sky. Gianna walked quickly, keeping her hood pulled low over her eyes. As she turned into her alley, her heart sank. The heavy wooden front door of her workshop hung open, its iron latch violently splintered. From the frame, Gianna rushed inside, stepping into absolute chaos. Shelves had been ripped from the stone walls, crashing onto the floor. Ancient parchments, leather bindings, and jars of ink lay shattered and trampled into the dust. Her father's workbench, the place where he had spent 40 years restoring history, had been hacked apart with heavy axes. Every page of research, every historical map, and every book she owned had been thoroughly searched and stolen. The intruders had left nothing behind. Tears burned Gianna's eyes as she knelt in the center of the ruined room, picking up a torn fragment of a century-old map. They were looking for the ledger. They knew her father had found the path to the hidden library, and they thought he had left the map in his shop. She reached beneath her cloak, feeling the hard, rectangular outline of the small notebook tucked safely against her skin. They had ransacked her home, but they had missed the target. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked near the doorway behind her. Gianna spun around, her hand reaching for a heavy bronze inkwell resting on a broken table leg. A shadows fell across the threshold as a broad figure stepped into the ruined room, blocking the morning light. But it wasn't a mercenary in armor. It was a young man wearing the mud-spattered leather coat of a river courier, a dark scar running down his left jawline. "You're Gianna Rossi," the stranger said, his voice low and sharp. "You need to come with me, right now, before they realize they left you alive." Gianna stood her ground, clutching the bronze inkwell tightly in her fist. "Who are you? Did Count Lorenzo send you?" The young man let out a dry, humorless laugh, stepping fully into the light of the broken doorway. "If I worked for Count Lorenzo, you'd already be in chains at the Palazzo Medici. My name is Marco. Father Matteo sent me." Gianna lowered the inkwell slightly, eyeing him with suspicion. Marco looked less like a scholar and more like a street fighter. His boots were covered in river silt. A long dagger was strapped to his belt, and his eyes shifted constantly toward the alley outside. "Matteo knew you'd ignore his advice and come back here," Marco said, leaning against the broken door frame. "He knows how scholars think, stubborn to a fault. He hired me to make sure you didn't end up at the bottom of the Arno River." "I don't need a mercenary," Gianna said sharply, stepping over the scattered ruins of her workshop. "I'm not a mercenary, Signorina. I'm a courier," Marco replied, stepping closer and lowering his voice. "I move things through Florence that the nobility and the church don't want people to see. Underground tunnels, forgotten drainage channels, river barges." Right now, every guard working for the Medici syndicate is hunting for a woman carrying a leather ledger. Your shop is destroyed, your name is burned, and by noon, your picture will be posted on every city gate. Gianna swallowed hard. The reality of her situation settled in like a cold weight. Her safe, quiet life as a book restorer was gone. "Father Matteo is waiting at the old granary near the river," Marco continued, offering her a dark, heavy traveling cloak. "If you want to decode whatever secret your father died for, you need to stay alive long enough to read it. Put this on." Gianna looked around her ruined shop one last time, taking in the splintered wood and torn pages of her youth. She pulled the hood of the cloak over her face and looked at Marco. "Lead the way," she said quietly. Hidden in the damp upper loft of an abandoned grain warehouse along the Arno River, Gianna, Father Matteo, and Marco gathered around a low wooden crate. A single oil lamp illuminated the pages of her father's ledger spread out before them. Outside, rain had begun to fall, tapping softly against the terracotta roof tiles. "Look here." Gianna pointed to a series of hand-drawn geometric symbols written beside a Latin passage. "My father didn't just write in ciphers. He used spatial references based on Brunelleschi's architectural plans. This symbol represents the foundation stones of the Dominican monastery at Santa Maria Novella." Father Matteo leaned in, his wire-rimmed spectacles reflecting the yellow lamplight. "Santa Maria Novella. That crypt has been sealed since the Black Plague outbreak of 1348. The church closed the lower catacombs because the structural vaults were collapsing. That's exactly why the library would be hidden there," Marco said, tracing a finger across the drawn map. "No municipal guards go down there. No thieves. No inspectors. It's a dead zone." "It's not just a dead zone. It's a maze," Gianna corrected, turning to the next page. "My father left a specific coordinate, beneath the fifth arch, where the stone lion meets the water channel. there is a marker embedded in the wall, a seal that unlocks the first compartment of the vault. "And what exactly is inside this vault?" Marco asked, crossing his arms. "Gold? Relics? Knowledge," Father Matteo said softly. "Lost texts from the Academy of Athens, original manuscripts of Islamic mathematics, and political blueprints left by freedom thinkers before the city fell to tyrants. Things worth more than gold to men like Count Lorenzo, who wish to control what people are allowed to know." Marco looked between the monk and the young scholar, letting out a breath. "Well, if we're going into sealed plague crypts beneath a Dominican monastery, we need to move before the rain floods the lower channels. The water in the drainage pipes rises fast." Gianna packed the ledger securely into a waterproof leather satchel. "We go tonight." The smell of damp earth and centuries of decay filled the narrow passageway beneath Santa Maria Novella. Marco led the group, holding a flickering pitch torch high above his head, its orange flame casting long, dancing shadows against the rough stone walls. Gianna walked close behind him, her satchel clutched tightly against her chest. WIL, while Father Matteo brought up the rear, his rosary beads clinking softly against his wooden belt. They had slipped into the monastery through a forgotten coal chute, descending deep into the subterranean foundation levels. Water dripped rhythmically from the vaulted ceiling, echoing like hollow footsteps in the darkness. "Watch your step here," Marco whispered, pausing at the edge of a steep stone staircase covered in slick green moss. The flooring drops into the old drainage canal below. Gianna looked down into the gloom. Far beneath them, black water surged through a narrow stone conduit, carrying the night's rainwater toward the river. She opened the ledger by the torchlight, checking her father's notes against the archways. "The fifth arch is just ahead," she said, her voice echoing faintly. "Look for a stone carving of a lion's head with its jaws open." Marco moved the torch along the wall. The wall was lined with dusty stone burial niches, many sealed with cracking marble slabs. Suddenly, the light reflected off a weathered stone relief, a roaring lion carved directly into the central keystone of the fifth vaulted arch. "Here?" Gianna gasped, stepping forward. But before she could reach the carving, Marco suddenly gripped her arm, pulling her back into the deep shadow of the archway. He instantly brought his torch down, smothering the flame in a pile of damp silt near his boots. Pitch blackness swallowed them whole. "What is it?" Father Matteo whispered into the dark. "Silence," Marco breathed into Gianna's ear. From the far end of the long catacomb corridor, the faint glow of approaching torches appeared in the gloom. The dull, heavy sound of iron boots echoed off the stone walls, accompanied by the cold, metallic unsheathing of blades. The iron ring had found the entrance. In the suffocating darkness of the catacomb, Gianna held her breath. The flickering orange light of the mercenary torches grew brighter, casting long, menacing shadows down the stone corridor toward their hiding spot. "Search every burial niche!" a harsh, raspy voice shouted from the dark corridor. "Count Lorenzo wants that ledger, and he wants the girl. She couldn't have gone far." Marco pressed his back against the cold stone, his hand resting on the hilt of his short sword. He caught Gianna's eye and shook his head softly. "Do not make a sound." Gianna slowly reached out in the dark, her fingers tracing the rough surface of the stone wall beside her. Her fingertips brushed against the carved lion's head. Remembering her father's notes, She slid her fingers inside the lion's open stone jaws. Deep within the mouth, her fingers hit a smooth, cold metallic lever. She looked at Matteo and Marco, taking a deep breath, and pulled the lever downward. A heavy, grinding sound of stone scraping against stone echoed loudly through the vaulted corridor. The mercenaries froze. "Over there, by the archway!" the head mercenary bellowed. "Run!" Marco yelled, pulling his sword. Behind the lion's carving, a narrow stone panel slid back into the wall, revealing a tiny hidden chamber illuminated by a soft, pale luminescence. Gianna ducked inside the opening, followed closely by Father Matteo. Marco stepped in last, using the pommel of his sword to strike a release catch inside the frame. The heavy stone door slammed shut with a thunderous boom just as the first mercenary thrust a spear through the opening. Safe inside the hidden room, Gianna gasped for air. The air was dry and smelled of old parchment and cedar. Embedded in a small stone altar in the center of the room sat a carved obsidian cylinder, glistening under the light of small glowing quartz crystals set into the ceiling. Gianna approached the altar, her hands shaking as she reached for the dark stone key. "It's the first piece," she whispered. The moment Gianna lifted the obsidian cylinder from its stone pedestal, a hollow, mechanical click echoed through the tiny vault. Deep within the walls, heavy counterweights dropped, and the air in the small chamber instantly grew still and heavy. Outside the thick stone door, the sound of muffled laughter echoed through the rock. "Did you really think it would be that easy, scholar?" The harsh voice of the lead mercenary sneered through the small iron ventilation slits near the ceiling. "Count Lorenzo knew your father built traps into these vaults." Gianna rushed to the stone door, pressing her hands against the smooth surface. It was completely immovable. From outside came the heavy, metallic clanking of iron bars being wedged into the outer doorframe. "Enjoy your father's legacy, girl," the voice mocked. "By tomorrow morning, the air in that tomb will be long gone." The sound of receding footsteps echoed down the outer corridor until absolute silence returned to the small vault. "They've sealed the main entrance from the outside," Marco said grimly, stepping up to the door and shoving his weight against it. It didn't budge a millimeter. "The iron bars are dropped from the exterior frame. We can't break through this stone without heavy tools." Father Matteo sat down heavily on a stone bench, pulling his woolen cloak around his shoulders. "May God have mercy on us. The ventilation slits are too narrow for a child, let alone a man." Gianna felt a wave of cold panic rise in her chest. She looked down at the dark obsidian cylinder in her hand, then at her father's notebook lying open on the stone altar. "No!" Gianna said firmly, wiping a bead of cold sweat from her forehead. "My father didn't design this place as a tomb." He was a restorer, a preserver of life and knowledge. Every mechanism he built had a dual purpose. She held the obsidian cylinder up to the glowing quartz light in the ceiling. Small, intricate grooves were etched around its base. Grooves that matched the pattern of the drainage channel map in her father's ledger. "Look at the floor," Gianna called out, pointing to a small, circular iron grate set into the center of the stone room. Beneath the iron bars, the roaring sound of rushing water echoed from the darkness below. "That isn't just a drain, it's an escape route." The air inside the hidden chamber grew noticeably thinner. Without hesitation, Marco dropped to his knees beside the circular iron grate set into the floor. He gripped the rusted iron bars with both hands, planting his heavy boots against the stone edge, and pulled with all his might. With a harsh screech of oxidized metal, the grate popped loose. A wave of damp, cool air rushed up from below, carrying the heavy scent of underground mud and rushing river water. "It leads straight down to the medieval drainage pipe system," Marco said, peering into the black abyss. "The same pipe system that empties out right along the western bank of the Arno River. If we time the current right, we can ride the runoff out before the mercenaries realize how we escaped." "And if the water level is too high?" Father Matteo asked, looking down anxiously. "Then we'd drown," Marco replied bluntly, offering a grim smile. "Choose your poison, suffocate in a sealed crypt, or take your chances with the Florentine sewers." Gianna did not hesitate. She secured her father's ledger tightly inside her waterproof satchel, tucked the obsidian cylinder into her inner coat pocket, and swung her legs over the edge of the stone shaft. "Let's go." One by one, they dropped into the darkness. The water was ice cold, instantly soaking through their boots and heavy garments. The current was fierce, dragging them forward through the narrow, brick-lined tunnel, where the only illumination was the faint, ghostly glow of phosphorescent mold clinging to the damp masonry overhead. Marco took the lead, using a wooden pole to fend off floating debris and iron grates blocking the path. The roar of the rushing water echoed deafeningly against the curved stone ceiling, drowning out their shouts. After what felt like hours of agonizing crawling and swimming through the subterranean maze, a pinprick of pale gray light appeared ahead. The tunnel opened abruptly, spitting the trio out into the open air, just beneath a stone bridge, as they plunged directly into the muddy, swirling waters of the Arno River. Gasping for breath, they scrambled onto the muddy riverbank, under the cover of the morning fog, hidden from the eyes of the city watch. High above the riverbanks, inside the luxurious, frescoed halls of the Palazzo Medici, Count Lorenzo de' Medici stood by an arched window overlooking the waking city. His silk doublet was embroidered with gold thread, but his face was carved from stone, twisted into a mask of bitter frustration. The heavy oak doors of the chamber swung open, and the lead mercenary from the catacombs stepped inside, bowing his head in nervous silence. "Explain to me," Lorenzo said softly, his voice dangerously low, "how three people, a monk, a disgraced girl, and a petty courier, managed to slip out of a sealed crypt guarded by my best men. They used an emergency drainage bypass, my lord," the mercenary stammered, keeping his eyes fixed on the marble floor. "The old Roman aqueduct channels beneath Santa Maria Novella. We checked the other end too late. They're gone." Lorenzo turned sharply from the window, slamming his fist onto a heavy mahogany table. A crystal wine decanter rattled violently against the wood. "Incompetent fools," Lorenzo snarled. "That hidden library contains the lost architectural and engineering blueprints of the ancient world. With those texts, my faction could control the military fortifications of every major city-state, from Milan to Rome. The Church wants those books burned to protect their dogma, but I want them weaponized." He paced across the room, his eyes narrowing. If Gianna Rossi had successfully retrieved the obsidian cylinder from the first vault, she now held the key to the second marker, and the second marker pointed to something far more dangerous. "Listen to me carefully," Lorenzo commanded, his voice turning cold. "Double the bounty across all of Tuscany. I want her face posted on every tavern wall, every marketplace, and every church gate from here to the coast. Alive, she leads us to the rest of the library. Dead, well, at least the secret dies with her." The mercenary bowed hurriedly and backed out of the room, leaving Lorenzo alone in the grand hall. The hunt had escalated from a quiet recovery mission into an open war for the future of Renaissance Italy. Drenched in river mud and shivering from the chill, Gianna, Matteo, and Marco retreated to a safe distance outside the city center, taking refuge in an abandoned wine cellar nestled among the terraced hillside orchards behind the Boboli Gardens. The small stone cellar was dark, dry, and hidden behind a thick wall of overgrown olive trees and wild grapevines. Marco bolted the heavy wooden door from the inside and lit a small oil lantern, casting a warm, flickering glow across stone walls lined with empty wine racks. Father Matteo helped Gianna unpack her satchel, making sure the precious ledger had survived the swim through the drainage pipe. Miraculously, the thick calfskin binding had protected the pages inside. "We can't stay in Florence much longer," Marco said, wiping dried mud from his cheek with the back of his hand. "The city gates are locked down. Word has spread fast. The Medici guards are stopping every traveler, checking faces against descriptions provided by Lorenzo's informants." Gianna laid her father's notebook out on an empty oak barrel. She placed the dark obsidian cylinder beside it and fit its base into a sketched alignment circle on the page. A sharp click echoed through the silent cellar as the obsidian cylinder slid smoothly into place, projecting a faint beam of light through its translucent stone facets onto the parchment map. "Look at that!" Gianna breathed, leaning closer as glowing crimson lines appeared on the paper, revealing hidden text that was invisible under normal light. The first vault was just a test, a decoy to weed out those who didn't truly understand our Father's work. "Where does the second clue point?" Father Matteo asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Gianna traced the glowing red lines across the map. "It doesn't point to another church or catacomb. It points north to a private art gallery in Venice, owned by a disgraced Venetian doge who collected forbidden Greco-Roman artifacts." Marco let out a long whistle. "Venice, that's over 100 miles through hostile territory, with the Medici watching every road and canal. It's our only choice," Gianna said, determination hardening her voice. "If we stop now, my father's life work and the hidden library falls into Lorenzo's hands forever." The journey across the rugged Apennine Mountains was grueling. Disguised as itinerant pilgrims traveling north toward the Venetian Republic, Gianna, Matteo, and Marco navigated narrow mountain trails, avoiding major trading roads where Medici patrols checked papers. By the time they reached the misty, winding canals of Venice 3 weeks later, the crisp autumn air carried the sharp scent of salt water, decaying seaweed, and burning wood smoke. Venice in 1528 was a labyrinth of marble palaces rising straight out of the emerald green lagoon, connected by hundreds of arched bridges and crowded with merchants, sailors, and spies from across the globe. Meeting inside a cramped, damp tavern near the Rialto Bridge, Marco spread a smuggled architectural sketch across the sticky wooden table. The second item we need is called the Astrolabe of Venice, Gianna explained, pointing to a detailed drawing in her father's ledger. It's an advanced mechanical navigation device created by Byzantine scholars centuries ago. Without its exact calibration rings, we cannot unlock the secondary entrance to the library back in Florence. And where is this astrolabe kept? Marco asked, taking a sip of bitter red wine. Inside the private gallery of Senator Giovanni Contarini, Father Matteo answered, adjusting his woolen cowl. Contarini was known as an eccentric collector who hoarded ancient treasures behind heavily guarded estate walls overlooking the Grand Canal. Contarini's palazzo is a fortress, Marco warned. Private guards patrol the courtyards day and night, and the canals around his estate are monitored by armed gondoliers. We won't break in through the front, Gianna said, studying the structural blueprints of the palazzo. Contarini keeps his private collection in a sea-level gallery room, accessible only by water. Marco, you can navigate your courier boat right up to the underwater mooring gate. And what about the security guards inside? Marco asked, with a wry grin. We create a distraction, Father Matteo suggested quietly. A public commotion outside the main courtyard gates to draw the guards away from the water entrance, while Gianna and I slip inside to retrieve the astrolabe. Marco nodded slowly, a plan forming in his eyes. All right, let's go pay a visit to Senator Contarini. Midnight over the Venetian lagoon brought a dense, pearlescent fog that muffled the sound of boat oars dipping into the water. Marco's narrow wooden skiff glided silently along the stone foundation wall of Palazzo Contarini. The grand marble balconies above loomed like pale ghosts in the mist, while warm amber light flickered from the high arched windows of the senator's reception hall. True to his word, Marco had staged a brilliant distraction half a mile away, near the Piazza San Marco, a simulated brawl involving a band of rowdy foreign sailors shouting accusations of corruption against Contarini's shipping interests, drawing nearly all the estate guards away from the waterfront. This is the mooring gate, Marco whispered, pointing to a rusted iron grating set low into the wet marble wall, just above the waterline. Gianna stepped carefully from the bobbing boat onto the slippery stone ledge, steadying herself against the wall. She pulled a set of iron lockpicks from her satchel, tools of the trade she had learned during her restoration years. She inserted the thin metal pick into the old keyhole of the water gate, closing her eyes and listening closely to the subtle internal clicks of the mechanism. Beside her, Father Matteo kept watch, holding a small dark lantern ready. Click. The heavy latch gave way with a soft snap. Gianna pushed the iron gate open, and a wave of stagnant air spilled out from the interior exhibition hall. Be careful, Marco whispered from the boat. I'll wait right here. If you're not back in 20 minutes, I'm coming in after you. Gianna and Father Matteo slipped through the narrow opening, stepping into the dark, echoing gallery room. Rows of glass display cases stretched into the shadows, filled with ancient Greek pottery, Roman coins, and strange mechanical contraptions. The ambient sound of water lapping against the exterior walls echoed softly through the hall. Look at the celestial charts on the back wall, Gianna whispered, moving quickly across the mosaic floor. The astrolabe should be housed in the central pedestal. As they reached the center of the hall, the beam of Matteo's lantern illuminated a circular marble stand. Resting atop it was a complex, beautifully crafted brass instrument, its rings gleaming under the yellow light. The astrolabe of Venice. Gianna reached out, her fingertips gently brushing the cool, polished brass of the astrolabe. As she lifted it from its marble stand, she noticed a hidden compartment at the base of the pedestal, containing a stack of folded parchment letters sealed with the official red wax crest of the Vatican Curia. Curiosity overriding caution, Gianna broke the wax seal on the top letter and unfolded the document. By the dim light of Matteo's lantern, she scanned the Latin text, her breath caught in her throat. "Father, look at this," she whispered, handing the letter to Matteo. Matteo's eyes scanned the lines, and his weathered face turned pale. By all that is holy, this is correspondence between high-ranking cardinals in Rome and Senator Contarini. "What does it say?" Marco called out softly from the open water gate behind them, growing impatient. "It's a conspiracy," Matteo murmured, his hands shaking slightly as he held the paper. "The church isn't just trying to suppress the hidden library because of theological differences. They are searching for a specific historical manuscript detailing ancient taxation and sovereign land deeds across Italy. Deeds that prove the Vatican's current territorial holdings in Florence and Rome were acquired through forged documents centuries ago." Gianna stared at the letter in shock. "It's not just about philosophy or science. It's about power, land, and billions in wealth. If the library contents are made public, the entire financial structure of the papacy collapses." Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the quiet atmosphere of the gallery. The heavy metallic clank of a closing iron door, echoing from the upper corridor. Footsteps began descending the marble grand staircase, accompanied by angry voices speaking in sharp Venetian dialects. Someone tipped off the guards. Marco hissed, stepping halfway through the water gate. "Hurry! They're coming down the stairs!" Gianna tucked the astrolabe securely into her satchel, alongside the incriminating letters. Without a second thought, she and Father Matteo bolted across the mosaic floor toward the water exit, just as the gallery doors flew open, flooding the room with bright torchlight. Gianna dove headfirst through the open iron gate into the waiting skiff, splashing into the cold water as Marco shoved the boat away from the palazzo wall into the foggy canal. Far from the prying eyes of Venice, deep within the ruins of an abandoned maritime watchtower, on a desolate island in the lagoon, Gianna, Matteo, and Marco set up their temporary camp. A cold wind howled through the broken stone windows, but inside the sheltered chamber, a small charcoal brazier provided steady warmth. Gianna placed the newly acquired astrolabe of Venice onto a flat wooden crate. Beside it, she laid out her father's ledger and the obsidian cylinder. "We have all three pieces now," Gianna said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "The ledger, the obsidian key, and the astrolabe. But how do they connect to find the final entrance back in Florence?" Father Matteo stepped forward, pointing to the complex gear rings of the astrolabe. "An astrolabe is an analog computer, Gianna. It tracks the movement of celestial bodies based on specific geographic coordinates." Your father didn't just hide a map. He locked the final coordinates to a specific night sky. "Which night?" Marco asked, crossing his arms. "The night The library was originally sealed. Matteo replied, October 14th, 1492, the year the Medici were first driven from Florence during the popular revolt. Gianna's hands flew across the brass dials of the astrolabe, aligning the zodiac rings and calendar markers to the exact date and planetary alignment recorded in her father's notes. She adjusted the sighting vane and held the obsidian cylinder behind the lens, aiming the apparatus toward the open stone arch of the watchtower window, where the clear night sky was visible. As moonlight passed through the complex arrangement of glass, brass, and obsidian, a sharp beam of concentrated light projected across the stone floor of the tower. The light illuminated a detailed, three-dimensional topographical map of Florence, carved into the very mortar of the floor, revealing a hidden tunnel network that connected the ancient Roman theater ruins directly beneath the city center. There, Gianna whispered, pointing to a glowing intersection marked by a small star symbol. That is the true entrance to the Bibliotheca Abscondita. Not a church, not a catacomb, but beneath the ancient Roman amphitheater. The return journey to Florence was fraught with tension. Knowing that Count Lorenzo's network spanned every major road and river checkpoint, the trio traveled separately, posing as humble merchants and pilgrims before reuniting at a prearranged safe house on the outskirts of the city. It was late evening when Marco returned to the abandoned brick kiln that served as their rendezvous point. He shook rainwater from his heavy leather coat, locking the wooden door behind him. "The city is crawling with Medici enforcers," Marco reported, breathing heavily. "They've placed checkpoints on every bridge across the Arno. Word is, Count Lorenzo himself has arrived in Florence to oversee the search." Gianna nodded, carefully packing the astrolabe, the obsidian cylinder, and the ledger into her satchel. "We don't need to cross the city bridges." The map from the astrolabe shows an old aqueduct tunnel that runs straight from these hills directly to the Roman amphitheater ruins. Father Matteo was unusually quiet, sitting in the shadows near the brick fireplace, staring intently at the glowing embers. "Is something wrong, Father?" Gianna asked, noticing his silence. Matteo hesitated, then slowly stood up. "Gianna, throughout our journey, I have watched you risk everything to preserve your father's legacy. But I must ask myself, are we leading humanity toward truth, or are we walking straight into a trap?" Before Gianna could answer, a sudden, heavy crash echoed from outside. The wooden front door splintered inward, bursting off its iron hinges in a shower of wood splinters. A dozen armed mercenaries rushed into the kiln, their polished steel breastplates gleaming in the firelight. At their head stood Count Lorenzo de' Medici, a cold, triumphant smile playing across his lips. "Well done, Father Matteo," Lorenzo said smoothly, stepping into the room. Gianna froze, her heart stopping in her chest. She slowly turned her head to look at Matteo. The monk would not meet her eyes, keeping his head bowed in heavy silence. "You sold us out," Gianna whispered, her voice breaking with betrayal. "I did what was necessary for the peace of Florence," Father Matteo said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual warmth, though grief lingered in his eyes. "The Church offered amnesty, Gianna. They promised that the dangerous philosophical texts would be safely locked away in the Vatican archives, rather than used to spark bloody rebellions across Italy." "You traded truth for safety, Matteo!" Marco roared, lunging forward to draw his short sword. Before Marco could take 2 steps, 3 mercenaries lunged out of the shadows, slamming him to the stone floor and disarming him with brutal efficiency. Count Lorenzo stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with sick satisfaction as he stopped directly in front of Gianna. He reached out, his gloved hand yanking the leather satchel straight off her shoulder. "Thank you, Signorina," Lorenzo mocked, unbuckling the flap to reveal the ledger, the obsidian cylinder, and the astrolabe of Venice. "You have saved my scholars months of frustrating guesswork. With these 3 artifacts, the Bibliotheca Abscondita is finally mine." Gianna glared at him, a fierce defiance replacing her initial shock. "You can steal the keys, Lorenzo, but you cannot open the vault. The final mechanism requires living knowledge, a bloodline translation that only my father possessed, and that he passed down to me alone. Without me, that library remains locked forever." Lorenzo's smile faltered slightly for a fraction of a second before hardening into cold arrogance. "Then it is fortunate that you will be joining us on our little expedition to the amphitheater tonight, isn't it?" He gestured sharply to his guards. "Tie the courier and secure the girl. We leave for the Roman ruins immediately." As the mercenaries grabbed her arms, Gianna's eyes met Matteo's one last time. The old monk looked away, unable to bear the weight of what he had done. But as the guards dragged her toward the shattered doorway, Gianna managed to slip her hand into her coat pocket, her fingers closing tightly around a heavy steel scalpel she had hidden away under the cover of a moonless, overcast night. Count Lorenzo's contingent marched their prisoners through the sleeping streets of Florence, moving stealthily toward the ancient Roman amphitheater ruins located near the southern edge of the city walls. The ancient structure was a sprawling labyrinth of crumbling stone arches, overgrown ivy, and subterranean chambers that had stood forgotten since the fall of the Roman Empire. Torches flared against the dark stone walls as the mercenaries forced Gianna and Marco down a steep, rubble-strewn staircase leading deep into the subterranean vaults below the amphitheater floor. Father Matteo walked quietly at the rear of the procession, his head bowed in prayer. They stopped before a massive, iron-reinforced stone door set directly into the foundational bedrock. Carved into the stone above the archway was an inscription in classical Greek. "He who seeks truth must first master chaos." "Open it," Count Lorenzo commanded, shoving Gianna forward against the cold stone door. Gianna looked at the intricate, circular locking mechanism embedded in the center of the iron plate. It had 3 distinct slots, one for the ledger's cipher code, one for the obsidian cylinder, and one for the astrolabe. She glanced sideways. Marco was bound tightly by his wrists, guarded by 2 heavy-set mercenaries holding pikes. Further back, Matteo stood watching with a troubled expression. "I won't help you destroy history, Lorenzo," Gianna said defiantly, planting her feet firmly on the ground. Lorenzo's expression turned venomous. He drew a polished steel dagger from his belt and pressed the razor-sharp tip against Marco's throat. "If you do not open this door within 5 seconds, the courier dies right here on the stones. Choose your friend or your precious library." Marco didn't flinch, glaring defiantly at Lorenzo. "Don't do it, Gianna! Let him try!" Tears welled in Gianna's eyes as she looked at Marco. She knew Lorenzo had no intention of sparing either of them once the door was opened. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Gianna stepped up to the massive stone lock. She pulled the obsidian cylinder and the astrolabe from her coat, inserting them into their respective slots with shaking hands. "Very good," Lorenzo smiled, lowering his dagger slightly. "Now, enter the final sequence." Gianna raised her hand, not toward the lock, but flashing a sharp, hidden glint of steel. With lightning speed, she drove her concealed scalpel deep into the mechanical release cable just beside the doorframe, slicing the primary counterweight wire. Before Lorenzo could react, a deafening metallic snap echoed through the underground vault. The snap of the counterweight wire echoed through the subterranean chamber like a gunshot. Instantly, heavy iron portcullises slammed down behind the mercenaries, trapping Lorenzo's party inside the vaulted passage. Torches flickered violently as an ancient counter mechanism designed to seal the perimeter during a breach engaged with a deep, grinding roar. In the sudden confusion, Marco used his bound hands to slam his weight into the nearest mercenary, sending the man stumbling into Lorenzo. "Run!" Marco roared, using the sharp edge of a fallen pike to slice through his wrist bindings. In one desperate motion, Gianna didn't hesitate. She grabbed the satchel containing her father's ledger, the astrolabe, and the obsidian key, ducking under a swinging torch as chaos erupted in the dark corridor. To her shock, a hand grabbed her elbow from behind. It was Father Matteo. His face was pale, but his eyes held a sudden, fierce clarity. "This way!" Matteo yelled, pulling her toward a narrow drainage passage set low into the bedrock. "I didn't betray you, Gianna. I gave Lorenzo false coordinates to draw his main force into this lower trap. The real path to the library isn't here. It's back inside the heart of Florence." "You led him into a decoy?" Gianna gasped as they squeezed into the narrow stone conduit, Marco trailing right behind them with a captured sword in hand. "Your father taught me that a false trail is the best defense," Matteo panted, navigating the pitch-black pipe by memory. "Lorenzo's men are trapped in the outer Roman vaults for hours, but we must return to the city immediately. The true entrance lies beneath the Duomo itself." Behind them, the muffled shouts of Lorenzo's mercenaries echoed uselessly against the stone doors. Slipping through the subterranean aqueduct, the trio emerged an hour later near the fog-drenched banks of the Arno. Florence was wrapped in a thick, wet river mist. Disguised under heavy woolen cloaks, they slipped past the outer city gates, blending in with the early morning carts carrying firewood into the city center. The final stretch of their journey had begun. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the Duomo, loomed above the Florentine fog like a titan carved from white, green, and pink marble. Its massive dome, engineered decades earlier by Brunelleschi, reached into the morning clouds, a triumph of human genius and architectural mastery. Gianna, Marco, and Father Matteo slipped through the small northern sacristy door, using a heavy bronze key Matteo had carried hidden inside his rosary pouch. Inside, the grand cathedral was vast, empty, and silent. High above, morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting pools of crimson and sapphire across the polished marble floor. "Your father worked on the maintenance of the crypts beneath the main altar for 5 years," Matteo whispered, leading them down a narrow spiral staircase concealed behind a carved wooden altarpiece. The church believed he was merely stabilizing the foundation piers. In reality, he was rebuilding the entrance to the Bibliotheca Abscondita. They descended deep beneath the floor of the cathedral, stepping into the cool, silent crypt of Santa Reparata, the ancient 4th century church over which the Duomo was built. Roman mosaic floors lay preserved under stone arches, lit only by the soft glow of Marco's oil lantern. At the far end of the crypt stood a massive marble wall, bearing an intricate geometric relief of the Tree of Knowledge. Gianna stepped forward, pulling the obsidian key and the astrolabe of Venice from her satchel. The 3 artifacts must work together here. The astrolabe sets the date, the obsidian key unlocks the central gears, and the cipher in my father's ledger provides the exact sequence of rotations. She placed the astrolabe into a circular recess in the marble tree trunk and slid the obsidian cylinder directly into its center. With steady fingers, she turned the brass rings according to the mathematical formula written in her father's notebook. A soft, musical chime echoed through the crypt as hidden bronze gears began to turn. Deep within the wall, the massive marble wall split down the center, sliding smoothly into hidden recesses to reveal a long descending corridor, lined with smooth, dark slate tiles. Unlike the damp, rotting catacombs beneath Santa Maria Novella, the air in this passage was dry, clean, and scented with cedarwood and ancient parchment. Renaissance engineering at its absolute peak, Marco muttered in awe, raising his lantern to illuminate the ceiling. As they stepped across the threshold, the marble wall behind them slid shut with a soft, decisive click. They were inside. The corridor stretched forward into the darkness, punctuated by a series of floor pressure plates carved with distinct mathematical symbols, Greek letters, Roman numerals, and geometric shapes. "Stop!" Gianna called out, catching Marco by the shoulder just as his boot hovered over a stone carved with the letter Alpha. "Look at the walls!" Along both sides of the slate hallway were small, square openings, each housing the dark barrel. Gianna opened the ledger, scanning her father's notes. The path follows the Fibonacci mathematical sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. We must only step on tiles whose numerical value corresponds to the sequence of nature. Carefully, Gianna led the way, stepping only on specific floor tiles. First, the single circle, then the double triangle, then the triple star, and on into the gloom. Marco and Matteo followed precisely in her footsteps, their hearts pounding in the silent corridor. One wrong step would trip a mechanical lever, releasing a hail of iron darts from the walls. After 20 agonizing paces, they reached the end of the slate hallway, stepping safely onto a broad, solid stone platform. Behind them, the mechanical traps remained silent, vanquished by logic and intellect. Before them stood a heavy bronze double door, cast with life-size reliefs of ancient scholars, Plato, Aristotle, Archimedes, and Hypatia of Alexandria. In the center of the door was a simple iron latch, unadorned and unlocked. They had reached the threshold of the Bibliotheca Abscondita. Father Matteo stopped at the edge of the platform, his hand resting heavily against the stone wall. He looked at Gianna, his face lined with deep weariness and conflict. "Gianna, before you lift that latch, you must understand what happens the moment this door opens," Matteo said, his voice trembling slightly. We save my father's work, Gianna replied, her hand hovering over the iron latch. We do more than that, Matteo urged softly. Inside this room are lost scientific works, anatomical studies that challenge church doctrine, and political treatises that could tear down every noble house in Italy. If these texts are brought into the light, wars will be fought over them. Kings will seek to burn them, and men like Lorenzo will kill to own them. So what are you saying, Father? Marco interjected sharply, stepping up beside Gianna. That we should leave all this knowledge buried in the dark forever? Let the tyrants win by default? I am asking if the world is ready, Matteo said, looking directly into Gianna's eyes. Or if, by opening this door, we light a fire that consumes us all. Gianna looked at the bronze figures carved into the door scholars, who had dedicated and sometimes sacrificed their lives to preserve truth for future generations. Knowledge isn't a weapon, Father, Gianna said quietly, her voice ringing with firm conviction. It's a mirror. It shows us who we are. If we hide the truth because we fear what men might do with it, then darkness has already won. She gripped the iron latch and pressed it downward. The bronze doors swung inward without a sound, opening into a breathtaking subterranean hall of vast proportions. Gianna, Marco, and Matteo stepped onto an elevated gallery overlooking a cavernous circular library built deep into the bedrock of Florence. The ceiling was a magnificent dome lined with polished copper plates that reflected the warm, golden glow of dozens of oil lamps hanging from long iron chains. Racks of mahogany bookshelves curved in endless concentric circles around the hall, rising 3 stories high and accessible by brass spiral staircases and catwalks. Thousands upon thousands of leather-bound manuscripts, ancient papyrus scrolls sealed in glass tubes, and illuminated codices stood impeccably preserved in the dry, temperature-controlled air. By the saints, Father Matteo whispered, dropping to his knees on the marble floor. It's real. The entire lost heritage of classical civilization, preserved right beneath our feet. Gianna walked slowly along the upper gallery railing, tears of awe brimming in her eyes. On a desk near the center of the floor lay her father's personal spectacles, resting beside an unfinished catalog ledger. This was where he had spent the final years of his life, silently guarding humanity's greatest treasure. Look at these titles, Gianna breathed, touching the gilded spines of rare volumes. Lost plays of Sophocles, forgotten astronomical calculations from Alexandria, early mechanical drawings of flying machines, and detailed blueprints for clean municipal water systems. Marco walked along a lower shelf, running his hand over a heavy iron-bound vault containing political documents. This isn't just history, Gianna. This is a blueprint for a completely different world. A world where knowledge belongs to everyone, Gianna said softly. Suddenly, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the upper entrance passage behind them, followed by the metallic clatter of boots against stone. The defense traps in the outer hall had been breached. Count Lorenzo de' Medici had found the true trail. He didn't break the mechanical traps, Marco hissed, drawing his sword and backing toward the central staircase. He used gunpowder! The sharp scent of sulfur drifted through the bronze doorway, followed by the heavy footfalls of Lorenzo's personal bodyguard unit. Count Lorenzo stepped into the grand circular chamber, his face smeared with soot, his fine silk doublet torn, but his eyes wide with unholy triumph as he took in the endless tiers of ancient books. "Magnificent!" Lorenzo whispered, his voice echoing through the vast dome. "Greater than even the Vatican archives." A century of power condensed into one single room. Behind Lorenzo stepped 6 heavily armed mercenaries, carrying long wheel-lock pistols and broadswords. In the center of the lowest floor, resting on a pedestal carved from white Carrara marble, lay the crown jewel of the library, the Master Codex, bound in thick iron plates and sealed with a heavy lock. It contained the unified index and summary of every hidden technology, medical advance, and political secret housed within the library. Lorenzo walked down the spiral staircase, his boots clicking rhythmically against the metal steps. He stopped 10 paces from Gianna, Marco, and Matteo. "Give me the master key, girl," Lorenzo demanded, raising his wheel-locked pistol and aiming it directly at Gianna's chest. "You have played your part well. You led me directly to the prize. Now, hand over the key, and I might let you live out your days in a convent." Gianna stood in front of the marble pedestal, her hand resting on the iron-bound cover of the Master Codex. "This library wasn't built for men like you, Lorenzo," she said calmly, her voice echoing clearly across the vast hall. "It was built to protect truth from men like you. Truth is written by the victors, scholar," Lorenzo sneered, pulling back the hammer of his pistol with a loud metallic click. Before Lorenzo could pull the trigger, Marco lunged from behind a mahogany bookshelf, hurling a heavy bronze bookend with lethal precision. The bronze object struck Lorenzo's wrist, knocking the wheel-lock pistol from his grip as it discharged into the floor with a deafening bang and a puff of acrid smoke. "Guard the staircase," Marco shouted, engaging the lead mercenary with a flurry of sword strikes. Chaos erupted in the circular library. Steel clashed against steel, echoing loudly against the copper dome above. Father Matteo rushed forward, grabbing a heavy oak stool and shoving it into the path of 2 advancing guards, giving Gianna time to step behind the marble pedestal. "Gianna, the counter mechanism!" Matteo screamed over the din of battle. "Your father built a collapse sequence into the main archways. If the library is ever falling into tyrant hands, the entrance tunnels can be sealed forever." Gianna's eyes darted to the side of the marble pedestal. There, embedded in the stone base, was a small brass wheel, marked with her father's crest. The same crest carved into the obsidian key. "If I trigger the mechanism, the main access shafts collapse!" Gianna yelled back over the clashing blades. "We'll be buried alive if we don't get out." "Better buried than handed over to Lorenzo," Marco shouted, parrying a vicious strike from a mercenary's broadsword. Lorenzo recovered his footing, drawing a ornate rapier from his belt, his face twisted in rage. "Kill the courier! Grab the girl!" he screamed at his men. Gianna pulled the obsidian key from her satchel and jammed it into the pedestal wheel. She looked at Marco, who was holding off 3 guards near the lower catwalk, and then at Father Matteo, who was desperately trying to shield the rare manuscripts from stray torch flames. With a final decisive breath, Gianna turned the brass wheel full circle. Deep within the stone foundations of the cathedral above, massive iron gears engaged with a terrifying groan. The floor beneath their feet trembled violently as secondary support beams inside the entrance tunnels snapped, sending showers of dust and stone fragments raining down from the ceiling. The mercenaries froze in panic as the arched ceiling of the upper entry corridor caved in, blocking their only exit with tons of solid rock.
"You fool!"
Lorenzo shrieked, turning on Gianna as dust filled the air.
"You've trapped us all down here!"
We're buried under 60 feet of solid marble. The main entrance is gone, Gianna said coldly, standing tall amidst the falling debris. No army you command can dig through that rock before the air runs out. Lorenzo lowered his sword slightly, his eyes darting frantically around the crumbling room. The arrogance in his posture withered, replaced by the desperate instinct of a cornered predator. "Listen to me, Gianna," Lorenzo bargained, his voice turning smooth and frantic. "I have barges waiting on the river. I have golden banks from Venice to London. Help me find another way out of here. Take the Master Codex, and I will make you the wealthiest, most powerful woman in Italy. You can publish whatever books you want." Gianna looked at the powerful nobleman, seeing him for what he truly was, a desperate man terrified of losing control. "You don't understand, Lorenzo," Gianna said softly, picking up the Master Codex from its pedestal and sliding it into her satchel. "Knowledge isn't something you buy or bargain with. It belongs to humanity. There is no other way out," Lorenzo screamed. Lunging forward with his rapier, Marco stepped into his path, sweeping Lorenzo's blade aside with a heavy steel parry and slamming his shoulder into the nobleman's chest, sending Lorenzo crashing against the marble pedestal. "She said no," Marco growled, grabbing Gianna's arm. "Matteo, move! The emergency aqueduct shaft is on the lower level." Dust clouds filled the vast circular library as minor cave-ins began buckled the outer mahogany bookshelves. Ancient scrolls spilled across the marble floor like fallen leaves, and several hanging oil lamps plummeted from the ceiling, shattering against the stone and igniting small pools of flame along the central aisle. "The fire is spreading," Father Matteo called out, using his woolen cloak to smother a blaze creeping toward a collection of rare Greek manuscripts. "We can't leave these texts to burn. We can't save 30,000 books while the ceiling is coming down, Father," Marco yelled, grabbing 2 armfuls of priceless codices from the nearest display case and shoving them into his leather courier sack. "Grab what you can carry and move." Gianna rushed along the main desk, sweeping her father's personal notebooks, the catalog index, and 3 ancient medical treatises into her satchel alongside the Master Codex. Lorenzo scrambled to his feet, coughing through the thick smoke. Driven by absolute greed, he ignored the collapse overhead and began grabbing heavy, gold-embossed volumes from the central display shelves, stuffing them into his coat pockets. "My lord, we must retreat!" His remaining lead mercenary screamed, pulling at Lorenzo's arm as a massive stone block crashed down onto the upper gallery walkway, shattering the iron railing. "Release me, you coward!" Lorenzo spat, shoving the guard away. "These books are worth millions!" "Lorenzo, leave them!" Gianna shouted across the smoky room, pointing toward an iron door set low into the western wall near the floor drains. "The aqueduct tunnel is the only way out! The main vault is collapsing!" Lorenzo glared at her through the haze, his arms overflowing with heavy gold books.
I am a Medici. I take what is mine.
Before Gianna could reach him, a massive keystone from the upper central dome cracked under the immense pressure. With a deafening roar, tons of stone and mortar rained down onto the center of the hall, crushing the marble pedestal and cutting off the central aisle. In a wall of fire and debris, the air in the library grew thick with black smoke and choking dust. Gianna, Marco, and Father Matteo stood near the open iron door of the lower aqueduct tunnel, watching in horror as the central dome continued to crumble. Through the wall of fire and falling rock, Lorenzo emerged from the rubble, his face bruised, his clothes torn, still clinging desperately to two gold-bound books. He stumbled toward the aqueduct exit, his rapier drawn. You won't leave me here to die, Lorenzo panted, his voice ragged as he raised his blade toward Marco. I am taking that satchel and that tunnel. You still don't get it, do you? Marco said grimly, stepping between Lorenzo and Gianna. He raised his short sword, his eyes cold and steady. You fought for gold and power. We fought for the truth. And truth doesn't collapse under stone. Lorenzo lunged forward with a desperate, wild thrust of his rapier. Marco parried the strike easily, stepping inside Lorenzo's guard and striking the nobleman across the jaw with the heavy pommel of his sword. Lorenzo dropped to his knees, the gold-bound books slipping from his fingers and tumbling into the burning debris below.
Leave him,
Gianna said, grabbing Marco's coat sleeve as the ceiling above the lower gallery began to give way.
We have to go now.
Marco gave Lorenzo one final look, then turned and ducked through the narrow iron doorway into the dark aqueduct tunnel behind Father Matteo. Gianna stepped through last, reaching back to pull the heavy iron door shut. Through the narrowing gap, she saw Count Lorenzo kneeling amidst the smoke and ruins of his ambition. Surrounded by the burning embers of the world he had tried to conquer, she slammed the iron door shut and turned the locking wheel from the inside, sealing the vault forever as the aqueduct tunnel echoed with the deep, muffled roar of the final collapse. The muffled roar of the library's collapse slowly faded behind them, replaced by the cool, damp silence of the Roman aqueduct tunnel. Gianna, Marco, and Father Matteo leaned against the wet brick walls, gasping for air as their chest muscles burned from the smoke and exertion. In the pitch-black darkness, Marco struck a flint, lighting a small stub of wax candle he had kept tucked inside his coat. The faint yellow flame illuminated three faces covered in dust, soot, and sweat, but all three were alive.
Everyone all right?
Marco asked, his voice hoarse from smoke.
I am intact,
Father Matteo coughed, wiping soot from his eyes. Though my faith in structural engineering has been thoroughly tested tonight. Gianna held her satchel tight against her ribs. She unbuckled the flap and checked inside. The Master Codex, her father's notebook, the astrolabe, and a handful of priceless ancient manuscripts were safe and dry. We follow the incline, Gianna said, pointing down the narrow arched tunnel where a steady stream of fresh air flowed against their faces. My father's ledger notes that this aqueduct runs north under the city wall, discharging into the orchards beyond San Miniato. They walked in silence for nearly half an hour, navigating the ancient brickwork. The ground beneath their boots sloped gradually upward until the narrow tunnel opened into an overgrown stone cistern built into the hillside outside the eastern ramparts of Florence. Gianna stepped out into the crisp, cool morning air. The sun was just rising over the Tuscan hills, casting a warm golden light across the terracotta rooftops of Florence. In the distance, the grand dome of the Duomo stood proud and unbroken against the pink sky, betraying no sign of the silent revolution that had just taken place beneath its marble foundations. By mid-afternoon, news of the mysterious subterranean collapse beneath the city center had spread through every marketplace, tavern, and noble house in Florence. Rumors swirled that an ancient vault had caved in due to secret underground mining operations funded by Count Lorenzo de' Medici. When Lorenzo failed to return to his estate, his political allies panicked, fearing that his clandestine activities had exposed them to church inquisitions and municipal investigations. Within 48 hours, the Medici syndicate's grip on Florence crumbled. Without Lorenzo's leadership or the leverage of the hidden library's political secrets, his mercenary guild, the Iron Ring, fractured and fled the city. The Florentine Signoria launched an official inquiry into Lorenzo's illegal excavations, seizing his estates and freezing his massive banking assets. Sitting inside a quiet country inn 5 miles outside the city walls, Gianna read the official municipal proclamation posted on the wall. "They think Lorenzo was hunting for buried Roman gold," Marco said, setting 2 tin cups of warm spiced cider on the rough wooden table. "They have no idea what was actually down there." "It's better that way," Father Matteo said quietly, nursing his cup. If the world believed the library was gone, the hunt would finally end. The truth can mature in the shadows until humanity is ready to receive it. Gianna touched the heavy iron cover of the Master Codex, resting securely in her lap, under her cloak. "The library isn't gone, Matteo. The physical vault may be buried, but the seed of that knowledge is right here with us." "So what is our next move, scholar?" Marco asked, looking at her with a grin. "Because staying in Tuscany is still a good way to get arrested." "We go to Venice," Gianna answered, her eyes bright with determination. "Not to hide, but to print." Leaving the Tuscan hills behind, the trio traveled northeast toward the Adriatic coast, taking advantage of the chaotic collapse of Lorenzo's network to move freely. 2 weeks later, the salty breeze of the Venetian lagoon welcomed them back. But this time, they didn't come as fugitives hiding in dark alleys. They came with a clear purpose and the means to change history. Venice, in the early 16th century, was the printing capital of Europe. Guilds of master typographers and independent press operators worked tirelessly along the canals, churning out thousands of books that spread ideas faster than any monarch or pope could suppress them. Marco led them through the maze of the Cannaregio district to a secluded courtyard tucked behind an old boatyard. Inside a low-slung brick building, the rhythmic, metallic clatter of heavy iron printing presses echoed into the alleyway. "This is Aldous' shop," Marco said, knocking 3 times on the reinforced wooden door. "His family has been operating independent presses for 30 years. They don't ask questions about where a manuscript comes from, only if the truth inside is worth setting into type. The door opened, revealing an elderly man with ink-stained hands and sharp, intelligent gray eyes, wearing a leather apron. "Marco!" the master printer said, bowing his head slightly before looking at Gianna and Matteo. "I received your message from the River Courier. You claim to have texts that make the ancient masters look like schoolboys." Gianna stepped forward, unbuckling her satchel, and placed the Master Codex onto the printer's heavy oak workbench. "Master Aldous," Gianna said clearly, "I bring you the lost thoughts of Alexandria, Athens, and Florence, and we are going to give them to the world. Over the next 3 months, the quiet workshop in Cannaregio became a sanctuary of light and ink. By day, Father Matteo translated the ancient Greek, Arabic, and classical Latin passages from the Master Codex into clear, accessible Italian and vernacular languages. By night, Gianna worked alongside Master Aldous, carefully setting individual lead-type pieces into wooden composition frames, ensuring that every mathematical formula, anatomical drawing, and philosophical statement was reproduced with absolute precision. Marco managed the logistics, using his extensive network of river couriers, sailors, and merchants to secretly transport printed sheets out of Venice in hollowed-out wine barrels and grain sacks. From those hidden presses emerged hundreds of small, beautifully bound paper volumes, affordable, portable, and impossible to trace back to a single source. The impact across Europe was immediate and profound. In Paris, medical scholars marveled at anatomical diagrams that disproved centuries of medieval dogma. In Nuremberg, astronomers studied mathematical calculations that revealed the true movements of the stars. In London and Basel, political thinkers read treatises on human rights and constitutional governance that challenged absolute rule. In Rome, the Vatican Curia attempted to ban the mysterious books, placing them on index lists of forbidden texts. But it was too late. For every copy seized by an inquisitor, 10 more were printed and distributed in another city. The secret library was no longer a hidden vault buried beneath stone and mortar in Florence. It had been multiplied 10,000 times over, floating across oceans and continents, living inside the minds of students, doctors, thinkers, and ordinary citizens. The shadows had failed. The truth was out. On a quiet evening overlooking the Venetian lagoon, Gianna stood on the wooden balcony of their rented quarters, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and violet. The cool sea breeze ruffled the pages of her father's restored notebook, resting on the stone railing. Beside it lay the dark obsidian cylinder and the brass astrolabe of Venice, no longer instruments of secret maps, but cherished relics of a journey that had reshaped her life. Father Matteo stepped onto the balcony, holding a freshly bound leather book hot off the press. He handed it to her with a warm, gentle smile. "The first complete volume of your father's restored catalog," Matteo said softly. "Printed in 5 languages, distributed to university libraries in Padua, Oxford, and Prague." Gianna ran her fingers over the freshly embossed title on the cover. "The Heritage of Light." "He would have been proud, Matteo," Gianna whispered, a tear of quiet joy reflecting the setting sun. "He spent his whole life hiding these truths because he was alone. But now, no tyrant can ever erase them." He was not alone, Gianna, Matteo corrected gently. He had you. You carried the weight of his courage when the darkness tried to swallow it. Marco walked out onto the balcony, tossing a small pouch of silver coins onto the table. Our river couriers just returned from Milan. The entire first run sold out in 2 days. Printers in Germany are already pirating the text and making their own editions. Marco laughed, leaning against the wooden railing. When printers start stealing your work to make more copies, you know you've won. Gianna looked at her 2 companions, the rogue courier and the progressive monk, who had become her family in the storm. As the months turned into years, the small printing operation in Venice grew into a vast, decentralized movement known among scholars across Europe simply as the Order of the Page. Gianna became the master curator of the network, organizing hidden scriptoriums from Switzerland to the Netherlands, rather than keeping rare manuscripts in a single central library where a fire, war, or tyrant could destroy them. Her philosophy was revolutionary. True security lies in distribution. Whenever a rare manuscript was discovered in an ancient monastery or private collection, Gianna's couriers would copy it, digitize its layout through block printing, and distribute thousands of copies simultaneously across multiple countries. Father Matteo formally resigned his monastic vows, dedicating the remainder of his years to education. He founded a free secular school on the outskirts of Venice, teaching children of peasants, merchants, and sailors how to read, write, and think critically. A society that can read cannot be enslaved, Matteo would tell his young students every morning, holding up copies of the printed treatises they had rescued from the Florence vault. Marco expanded his courier network into a continent-wide intelligence and distribution system. His men did not carry gold or weapons. They carried knowledge. Smuggling forbidden books past hostile borders, royal inspectors, and religious guards with unmatched skill. One evening, while reviewing a newly arrived stack of printing proofs, Gianna found a letter tucked between the pages from a young female scholar in Nuremberg, thanking the anonymous publisher for changing her life through the translated works of Hypatia. Gianna smiled, pressing the letter to her heart. Her father's legacy was no longer just a memory buried in a ruined workshop behind Santa Croce. It was a living, breathing movement transforming the human spirit. In the spring of 1532, 4 years after the collapse of the vault in Florence, Gianna returned to Tuscany for the first time. Dressed in the simple, elegant attire of a prosperous Venetian merchant, she walked through the familiar cobblestone streets of Florence. The city had changed. The atmosphere of fear and political terror under Count Lorenzo had faded, replaced by a vibrant revival of art, debate, and open learning. She walked down the narrow alleyway behind Santa Croce, stopping before the small building that had once been her father's workshop. The front door had been repaired, and a new brass sign hung above the threshold. Rossi and Sons, book restorers and preservationists. Inside, young apprentices were busy cleaning aged parchment, binding leather covers, and studying classical manuscripts under the guidance of a master restorer whom Gianna had secretly funded through her Venetian network. She did not enter to reveal her identity. Instead, she stood quietly in the alley, watching the young students work under the warm candlelight, just as she had done with her father years ago. Gianna pulled her father's original leather ledger from her coat. She walked toward the Grand Basilica of San Lorenzo, stepping into the quiet, cool cloister garden where she had first fled on that fateful, stormy night in 1528. Beside a quiet stone fountain, surrounded by blooming white roses, Gianna knelt down. She pulled a small steel trowel from her satchel, dug a small hollow in the rich earth beneath an ancient olive tree, and placed her father's notebook inside a sealed bronze box. "Your work is finished, Father," she whispered into the quiet afternoon air. "The library is no longer hidden. It belongs to the world." She buried the box, smoothing the earth over with her hands, leaving no trace behind. Though their victory was great, Gianna and her allies knew that the struggle between knowledge and tyranny would never truly end. That evening, meeting Marco at a quiet riverside tavern overlooking the Ponte Vecchio, he laid a freshly intercepted letter onto the wooden table. The letter bore the crest of a powerful new political coalition forming in Northern Europe. Men who sought to censor the independent presses and control the distribution of printed books. New names, same motivation, Marco said, watching the dark waters of the Arno flow beneath the stone arches. Whenever people start thinking for themselves, someone in power gets terrified. "Let them try," Gianna said calmly, taking a sip of wine. 4 years ago, they only had to stop one girl with one notebook in Florence. Today, they have to stop millions of readers in 100 cities. They're establishing new border patrols along the Rhine, Marco warned. They're burning presses in cities where they have influence. Then we will build presses where they have none, Gianna replied, her eyes flashing with unwavering determination. "We will move north. We will print in England, in Sweden, across the ocean if necessary." Marco smiled, raising his tin cup in a toast. "To the endless game, then." "To the light," Gianna corrected, clinking her cup against his. They sat together as the stars emerged over Florence, watching the city lights reflect off the quiet river. They were no longer running from shadows. They were leading the charge into a new era, armed not with swords or gold, but with the indestructible power of the printed word. 10 years after the night she discovered her father's hidden ledger, Gianna Rossi stood at the head of a grand assembly hall in Geneva, Switzerland. Surrounding her were hundreds of men and women, translators, printers, couriers, scholars, and scientists who had gathered from every corner of the continent for the first International Congress of the Custodians of Truth. On the central oak podium rested the 3 original artifacts that had started it all: the restored ledger, the obsidian cylinder, and the astrolabe of Venice. "A decade ago," Gianna spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "a group of powerful men believed that truth was dangerous. They believed that common people could not be trusted with knowledge, that history belonged only to those who held the sword and the coin." She picked up the brass astrolabe, holding it high so the sunlight illuminated its intricate alignment rings. "They were wrong," Gianna continued. "Knowledge is not the property of kings, popes, or empires. It is the birthright of every human being born into this world. When we hide the truth, we live in darkness. But when we share it, we light a fire that no tyrant can ever extinguish." Applause erupted through the hall, a thunderous sound of voices representing a new world, rising from the ashes of medieval secrecy. Beside the stage stood Father Matteo, now an old man with white hair, smiling proudly with tears in his eyes. Beside him, Marco, wearing the fine coat of a successful international shipping director, nodded in quiet respect. They had not just saved a hidden library beneath the streets of Florence. They had built a fortress of human wisdom that would endure for generations to come. Decades passed, and the Renaissance blossomed into a full scientific and cultural revolution across Europe. In the late autumn of 1568, an elderly woman sat in a high-backed armchair by an arched window in a villa overlooking the Tuscan countryside. Her hair was silver white, her face lined with time, but her dark eyes remained as sharp, clear, and passionate as they had been in her youth. Gianna Rossi held a newly printed encyclopedia in her lap, a massive, multi-volume work containing the sum of human knowledge, printed in tens of thousands of copies and sold across the globe. On her desk rested a framed sketch of her father's old workshop behind Santa Croce, alongside a letter from her grandson, who was currently studying astronomy at the University of Padua, using texts she had helped rescue 40 years earlier. Outside her window, the sun was setting over Florence, casting a brilliant crimson and gold illumination across the grand dome of the Duomo and the sparkling waters of the Arno River. She closed her eyes and listened to the soft sound of the wind rustling through the olive trees in the courtyard below. She remembered the suffocating smell of smoke in the caving vault, the terrifying chase through dark catacombs, and the cold water of the underground drains. None of the fear remained, only a deep, quiet peace. The hidden library of Florence was no longer hidden. It was everywhere. It lived in every schoolroom where a child learned to read, in every laboratory where a doctor cured a disease, and in every quiet room where a thinker dared to question authority. Gianna smiled, resting her hands over the book on her lap, as the last rays of sunlight bathed Tuscany in golden light. The shadows of 1528 were gone forever. The light had won.